All right, in our last lecture, we did a survey of microorganisms, and now we're going to do a class on what would we consider botany and mycology, or plants and fungi. So remember, this is kind of our survey of the living world, what's out there, what can you learn more about, maybe find something that fascinates you, and we can continue learning about that as we move forward in our lives. So let's talk about plants, okay? Plants are multicellular photosynthetic organisms that are considered eukaryotes. They are adapted to a land existence, which is why algae and plants are separate. Algae, well, we might find some algae on land. It's only found in very wet, aquatic, moist, damp environments, and so it's not really adapted to a land existence. Think about if you pull algae out of a pond or a lake or the ocean and you let it sit, it will dry out and become desiccated or dried and not capable of surviving anymore. So we know that plants have become adapted to handling drying environments, handling gravity and being able to support themselves, and being able to be exposed to UV damage, which can cause damage to those tissues and can cause the leaves to die or not develop and grow properly. So when we talk about plants, we're talking about the ones found on land. Now, we know that they share a common ancestor with algae because they store carbohydrates in the same way as starch. They have cellulose in the cell walls, and they have chlorophylls A and B in their chloroplasts. However, very, very different in where they are found and how they are adapted to it. So in your pre-lecture, you do have a chapter 18 plants comparison table, and I started filling in the first one so you know what we're looking at. You'll find all of the information in the PowerPoint or in the lecture, so I hope you have that up and you're following along. Let's talk about our different groups here. So we have evolution of land plants, and there are 5 big events that characterize the development of plants on land into the different phyla or major classifications within the kingdom of Plantae or plants. So all plants that are on land have to protect their embryos from drying out. And so all of them have a way to protect embryos from drying out, and that includes your mosses, ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms, okay? Then we see vascular tissue arise, and vascular tissue increases the efficiency of moving water around the organism, which allows for them to also handle gravity by growing taller. And then we see leaves getting larger, so we call them megaphylls. Finally, seeds arise. So when you think about plants, you probably think about seeds, but really seeds are not a very early development of plants. That's kind of later in the timeline there. And then last but not least, you get flowers. So if you think about plants and flowers is the first thing that comes to your mind, that is actually the most recent lineage of plants, and one of the newest developments of about 150 million years ago. New being a relative term as far as timeline is concerned. So you will be asked to know about the mosses, lycophytes and ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. So let's talk about these major classifications or phyla. Our first phyla are called bryophytes, which we commonly also call non-vascular seedless plants. So let me pull that table up again here. You'll see the classification phyla as bryophytes. Common name is non-vascular seedless plants. Okay, and the name non-vascular seedless plants tells you a lot about this particular group of organisms. They do not have vascular tissue, so they don't have roots. They don't technically have shoots or leaves. They don't have xylem and phloem. They're very small, and if you think about a moss, that makes sense. If you haven't gone out and touched moss, please do so because it is the best. But they're short. They're found in shady, damp environments. If you're looking for moss, you're going to find them in cracks of concrete. To them, that's damp and wet. They can be adapted to dry environments, but if I want to go find moss, I'm not going to go look in the middle of a desert. I'm going to go to the forests. I'm going to go look at the base of trees. I'm going to look at areas where water pools. So on campus, coastal campus, there's the main area where they do graduation. There are a couple of areas where water drains, and it is just the greenest, brightest moss always in those areas. that is where I would go to find it. Moss doesn't get very tall, and in being short, it allows it to retain moisture, which then diffuses in osmosis directly across the tissues. They don't have vascular tissue to move that water around. It just moves across the tissues. They do reproduce sexually and asexually. They will grow in a mat, and so you'll get a nice mat of moss that's growing asexually. And then you'll have these sporophytes, these capsules, that will have spores that are spread by wind or water. Their embryos are protected by spores. They do not have seeds. The most familiar with our group here is mosses, but we do have things like hornworts and liverworts. I don't find those too often out in the wild, but I can find a moss in about 0.2 seconds. I tell you what, I love moss. It's one of my favorites. I tell people to go touch moss all of the time. Mosses dominate really dry, windy landscapes such as the Arctic. They can handle the dryness by getting all their moisture from the snow. They grow in really slow processes. They're slow metabolic rates. Love me some moss, okay? So when we have our non-vascular seedless plants, our next group then would be our vascular seedless plants or our seedless vascular plants. You'll see it either way, okay? And these guys still have spores for their embryos. They're still reproducing with spores. There's no seeds, okay? We also call this group pteridophytes, which is similar to pterodactyls in that the P is silent. And your pteridophytes have roots, stems, and leaves. The most common of these being your ferns. Most people are familiar with ferns. They're a very popular porch plant here in North Carolina. Sometimes the roots can be very well developed, but we call them rhizomes because they tend to be very tubular and potato-like. If you pull up a root of a fern out in the woods, you might find these rhizomes. They do have xylem and phloem in their vascular tissue. But again, if I'm looking for ferns, I'm going to go to the same sorts of areas that I find mosses. I'm going to go look in shady, wet areas. I'm going to look in forests. I'm going to look in areas where there's standing water. My backyard goes down into a crevice, and in that is a running pond, so it's kind of a runoff. We don't get flooding, which is nice. But that whole area back there is just littered with ferns, just all sorts of ferns. I think I have 4 different species in the woods behind my house. Absolutely fascinating. They do reproduce sexually and asexually. When they are reproducing asexually, they're just growing from those rhizomes, and those rhizomes will continue growing. When they reproduce sexually, they have on the backs of fern leaves, you'll see these little sori, or you'll see on some of these plants strobili. Some ferns have strobili, these little kind of cone-like shapes. They're not cones, they're cone-like. And those will produce the spores that are spread by wind or water. If you've ever been given flowers and on the back of some of the ferns you saw those little brown dots on the leaves, those are just the reproductive parts of the ferns. That's going to be those sori that I've talked about. Club mosses and whisk ferns are included in that. That's picture these first 2 here. My personal favorite are horsetails. I love horsetails. They're called equisetum. They're a hollow tube, very popular in marshland kind of environments. We do sometimes have some out here at outside of the science building, but if you ever go down towards Wilmington, there's a nursery. Their whole pond is just surrounded by horsetails, and they are beautiful. I love them. And then obviously ferns. Okay, with me so far? I think that's filling out the tables in location, reproduction, key traits, example organisms. Perfect. All right. Let's talk about what seeds are and why that evolutionary trait became so important. So seeds store food to protect the embryo, and they're protecting the embryo with a coat, whether that coat is going to be thick or thin, depends on the plant. And there's very, very big survival advantages here, okay? So seeds store food. So the embryo can overwinter. When we look at when mosses and ferns reproduce sexually, it's going to be at the appropriate time of year, when it's warm, when it's windy, when it's wet. And those seeds will, or those spores will get spread by the wind or water, they'll germinate, they'll grow, and it's a very quick time. But if I were to go look in the fall and try to find any pine trees that are seedlings little growing, or oaks or anything, I'm not going to see germination happening at that point in time. Instead, those seeds are able to overwinter and wait until the conditions are appropriate. Those conditions being enough water, the right amount of sunlight, the right temperatures, whether or not they've passed through the digestive tract of an animal. It all depends, okay? And so the survival advantage of seeds is really important because of the dominance of those seed plants now. When you go out, you are not going to find ferns and moss as the dominant plant life. Now, they were at one point in time the #1 plant life on this planet. But seeds and the ability of seeds to be spread actually plays a really, really big role in why we see pines and angiosperms, flowering trees and plants, being the dominant plants on this planet today. So within our seed plants, there are two kinds. You can have gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms means naked seeds, and that the ovule is not enclosed. There's no fleshy tissue around the seed. So if you ever see a pine seed, they look like little helicopters sometimes falling out. The cones will hold the seeds until they're mature and able to be dispersed, at which point those seeds will flit in the wind and float down through like helicopters. There's no fruit to those seeds. Angiosperms have the fruit and the berries and the things that we eat. And that's going to be a tissue that surrounds the seed completely. And that tissue may attract seed dispersers who eat the plant and the seeds and then poop that out somewhere else, so very common in our birds. Or it may provide food for that growing embryo, whatever it may be. So we do see the difference here too in the different seeds. The gymnosperm, we're going to have the cotyledons, which are those first leaves, and then a seed coat. And then in our angiosperms, we see the seed coat, and the cotyledons are the first leaves, as well as the endosperm or stored food. Very similar in structure. It's more about whether or not the seeds are surrounded by flesh or not. So let's talk about our gymnosperms, our naked seed plants, okay? Gymnosperms have very well developed vascular tissues and generally are woody. They are going to be able to withstand that gravity and grow to extreme heights. They are found worldwide and especially found in harsh environments that are dry, wet, cold, hot, whatever it may be. If we think about it, it makes sense. If you go up towards the tundra and you're heading into the Arctic, you're going to see tons of gymnosperms in terms of conifers, those needle-bearing trees. Here, right, our conditions in North Carolina are not considered just temperate. We may be in a more temperate region than maybe the deserts or the extreme rainforests. But we go long periods in the summer without rain. We have extreme rain then following that with flooding, high winds. And if you think about when we've had high winds with things like tropical storms and hurricanes, pine trees that are in this area tend to survive that fairly well. You tend to see more branches lost and trees completely uprooted in those angiosperms like oaks and maple trees than you would in the pine trees. They do really well in this variable, incredibly harsh environment. If you go up into the mountains, you start seeing gymnosperms, okay? These guys do reproduce sexually and asexually. They can grow out sometimes from the base depending on the species. Now, many of them have two separate sexes. So we're going to see male and female cones. The male cones are the ones that produce the pollen. We're heading into pollen season right now. It's March, so when I'm recording this, we're heading into that pollen season, and I've been seeing the pollen cones growing on the pine trees here. Those are all male cones. The female cones are going to be where the seeds are retained, and that will be stuck on the tree actually usually for 2 years or more in order to fully mature those seeds, but the male cones are dropped pretty quickly. The seeds and pollen are both wind dispersed. Some animals may disperse some seeds, like squirrels often disperse pine seeds by eating them or burying the pine cones, but a lot of them are wind dispersed. Okay, the most familiar of our gymnosperms are conifers like pines, but this includes all conifers, including things like junipers, which is the first picture here. We also have included in this group ginkgos, so ginkgo biloba with these beautiful fan leaves, and cycads, which some people know as the sago palm. All of these are technically modified leaves, and they're considered needles. They're not considered true leaves in the sense that when you think about a leaf of a plant. Talking about our conifers though, just to dig in a little bit more, again, here's the difference in those cones. You have pollen cones and seed cones. The same tree will hold both. The pollen cones are usually found at the very tips of the branches. The seed cones are a little further up and higher in the tree to allow for more of that dispersal. The coastal redwood, for instance, is the tallest living vascular plant, nearly 300 feet high or 100 meters in height. And it is very dense, thick, woody tissue that allows it to survive in that. The coolest thing about the coastal redwood is that most of their water comes from snow melt rather than rain, and they survive on a very small amount of water every year. Fascinating. And the oldest known tree in the world is named Methuselah. It is a bristlecone pine, and you cannot find it. It is hidden. You are not allowed to go there. And it's expected to be about 4,500 years old. So very, very long-lived, very mature, strong, woody trees. And if you ever think about the difference in the woods, people want to build with pine because it is a very hard wood. Okay. Then we have our angiosperms. These are the ones that people think of when we think of plants. They think of flowers, they think of leaves, they think of grasses and trees. These are our angiosperms. These are the most successful group of land plants today, and they are found worldwide. For instance, there's over 10,000 known species of grasses and about 270,000 known species of angiosperms as a whole. They do have well-developed vascular tissues, whether or not they are woody. So woody stems are very common, but a lot of them are herbaceous. Things like grasses are considered herbs or herbaceous plants. We don't see woody grasses, but grasses are everywhere and incredibly successful. They do reproduce sexually and asexually. Some of them will self-fertilize, like Mendel's peas that we learned about, where they do their cross-pollination to themselves. Some of them will be pollinated by wind, insects, birds, or mammals. Some of them have separate sexes of the flowers, and some of them have flowers that have both sexes in one. A lot of them produce the different fruits, and most of our food plants are actually angiosperms. Sometimes you'll eat pine nuts, sometimes you'll eat fiddlehead ferns. I don't know of any mosses. You can eat some mosses, but most people don't eat mosses. Most of our food sources starts with our angiosperms. So let's talk about the perfect flower. A perfect flower in our flowering plants are flowers that have both male and female characteristics. So they're going to have males parts called stamens that produce pollen on the anthers, and they're going to have a female part called a carpel, which will hold the seeds and will develop the fruit if fruit is present. Both of these are contained within a corolla of petals, okay, the corolla of petals, and those petals, carpel and stamens are all held by something called a sepal, which is going to hold the carpel long term, but it actually is the green part of the flower, okay? You have a lab where you are expected to go out and find a flower, literally go outside and find a flower. Don't go buy a flower. You can go find them out in your yard. Or at the park or whatever, and look for all of these parts. You can find them and make sure that you can identify them, okay? In our angiosperms, though, we have a further division of classifications. We have two particular groups. We have monocots and dicots. So they're called monocotyledons and eudicotyledons. Monocot means having a single first cotyledon or first leaf. Eudicotyledons means true two leaves, so two cotyledons. So I have this beautiful figure here. And if I were going out into the field, I love to play this game. I play this game with my husband and my stepson of pointing to an angiosperm and saying, is it a monocot or a dicot, and why? And you can do it. You're expected to do this. So for instance, if you look at a seed, you can look and see if it has one cotyledon. So if you ever looked at a corn seed, when you take the seed coat off, there's usually one little kind of yellow, cream pale colored bit. That would be the seedling, and it's going to have one leaf. And when it starts to grow, one little leaf will poke out of the dirt. In things like a bean plant, when you look, it'll have 2 leaves, but if you go to plant it, it starts to grow, it'll have 2 little leaves poke out of the dirt. So that's the biggest difference there. That's why it's mono versus di. You might be able to tell from the roots if you pull the plant up. I don't suggest doing this, you don't have to. But fibrous roots, like what you find in grasses, are often monocot, whereas tap roots and very deep tap roots like you find in dandelions are dicot. You can tell by vascular tissue if you look at it under a microscope. I'm not expecting you guys to do that one, but this is where it comes in really important, and this is the game I play with my husband and stepson. You can tell by the leaf and the flower whether you are looking at a monocot or a dicot. If the leaf can be peeled, then it's a monocot. So if it can be peeled into strips, it's a monocot, and it has parallel veins. If you peel it and it breaks into pieces and it has net-like veins, it's a dicot. So that would be the difference between grass and a maple tree, okay? In addition, the flowers can tell you. If there are multiples of 3 for the sepals, the petals, the anthers, and the stamen, then you know that it is a monocot. If it's in parts of 4 or 5, multiples of 4 or 5, it's a dicot. Practice this, use this chart, go out and find 2 examples of a monocot and 2 examples of a dicot at a park or in your yard. I guarantee you can do it. If Kaden, my husband, can do it, you can do it, okay? Let's talk about a little bit of the benefits of plants, and then we're going to talk about fungi. So, economic and ecological benefits of plants. Well, obviously they are a food source. We are heterotrophs, they are autotrophs. We rely on plants to convert solar energy through photosynthesis into a sugar that we can use in cellular respiration. A ton of commercial products are made from plant parts, from things like fibers being used to make cotton, wood to make your house, etc. And most medications that we use actually come from plants. So things like aspirin was derived from willow bark. Things like digitoxin that can be used to treat heart health comes from foxglove. Absolutely beneficial. We should be doing more to save plants and planting more plants in general, not just trees. Ecological benefits include oxygen production, which is a byproduct of photosynthesis, not the end goal, and plants are not doing it for us. Forests play a really big role in water and carbon cycles, as well as reducing global climate change, reducing temperature, cleaning up toxic substances. Plants play a really big role in balanced, healthy ecosystems, not just from the perspective of food and energy, but from the perspective of blocking wind and reducing wind damage, reducing temperature by providing shade, reducing soil erosion. We found that clear-cutting forests is really bad for a lot of different reasons. So when we think about plants, it's not just food, okay? However, if someone handed me this board and said, here you go, I'd be so happy, right? Okay, those are your plants. Make sure you fill in your table with those different groups, filling in what the information is. And let's talk about fungi. For the fungi part of the table, I want you to pay attention to just the classification, body plan, benefits, characteristics, and organisms. So, fungi, I wish I had studied them more when I was in my graduate program. I was offered to study fungi and I decided not to, and I worked in a mycology lab going out and studying fungi. I didn't like mushrooms, so I was too cool for school. Now I'm a grown adult and I love mushrooms. In fact, I took both of these pictures. I think they're absolutely beautiful. I love it. I love it. Okay, so what makes a fungus a fungus? Okay, what makes a fungus a fungi? They are chemoheterotrophs. So they also consume external food sources. So they are not related to plants. They're actually more closely related to animals. Okay? However, fungi grow into their food and release enzymes, then they absorb the food into their bodies. Whereas animals have internal consumption and digestion and absorption. That's the big difference there, okay? Fungi can occur in 2 forms. They can be either unicellular as a yeast or multicellular, which are most fungi, and they do reproduce sexually and asexually. They reproduce asexually just by growing into that food source, and they reproduce sexually through wind-blown spores, which are created through reproductive structures that we call mushrooms. So while these look like mushrooms, we know they are fungi because we also see the white body part of the fungi, which is down in here called mycelium. Let's take a closer look at the body plan of a multicellular fungus. Generally speaking, fungi are mycelium, and they are everywhere all of the time. You only see the fruiting body or the mushroom when the conditions are either right or not right. So it could be that the conditions are wet and great, or it can be bad and the mushroom is trying to spread into a new food source. That fungi is trying to spread into a new food source, which is when the mushroom would be produced. Mycelium are the white fibers that you see in and around fungi. So if you pull up a mushroom, see these little white fungi fibers here in the growth. They kind of look like spider webs. That's the mycelia. That's the body of the fungus. Okay. The mushroom or fruiting body is relatively short-lived, but both the mushroom and the mycelium are made up of hyphae, which are the cellular structures that compose those two structures. The hyphae are densely, tightly packed. If you do like to eat mushrooms, if you get those white button mushrooms and you cut one and you kind of pull it a little bit, you'll see these little fibers come off. Those are hyphae, okay? Fungal cells are different from plant cells as well, because while they have a cell wall, it is made of chitin, and that chitin is very similar to the chitin we see in animal cell walls. So it's a little bit another clue that fungi are closer related to animals than they are to plants. Okay, that should fill in some of your table. Let's talk about the ecological benefits of fungi. They are incredibly important decomposers of plants, animals, and microbes. And honestly, if I have a choice and it's available, I want to be buried in a mycorrhizal coffin rather than a regular coffin, because you just start that decomposition right away by having the fungi nearby. They're incredibly important to returning that inorganic nutrients to those producers. If we don't have fungi and bacteria breaking down dead and decomposing matter, we would be up to our eyeballs in death, and obviously that's not fun. Some fungi are saprotrophic and are going to be the result why your strawberries get squishy when you start to see the mold growing on them. The mold is the fruiting body of that particular fungus, and the mycelia are throughout that entire fruit, and so that's why it looks squishy, is it's releasing enzymes and absorbing those nutrients. I'm going to ruin bread for everyone for just a second. If you find a spot of bread mold on your bread, the mycelia are throughout that entire loaf of bread. Now, you could be like my mom and my husband and just pick it off and eat it, and that's fine. Or you can be like me and be like, nope, I can no longer eat this bread. Just so you know, okay? And then, of course, this picture, I know probably all of you are wondering about this. If you're not, because you're familiar with it, that's awesome. These are called cordyceps fungi. Cordyceps fungi are very host-specific. They only infect certain species of insects, and they are going to use that insect as a nutrient source. The mycelia, the spores land on the insect, the mycelia grow throughout the insect, and then it will find a location and it will grow its fruiting bodies and release more spores. Love cordyceps fungi. Love cordyceps fungi is the basis of the zombie apocalypse. Strongly recommend reading The Girl with All the Gifts. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. Okay. Fungi actually form a lot of mutualistic relationships that we didn't understand up until recently. So we know now that mycorrhizal fungi help plants grow more successfully. The hyphae increase the surface area for absorption of food and nutrients for the plants, and the plants provide the fungi with sugars, which just increases general growth. I think if I were to ask anyone and say this plant was grown on the left, or where my cursor is, without the mycorrhizal fungi, and the other one was grown with the mycorrhizal fungi, most of us would argue that there's more leaves, not even argue, we could count them, and more roots, just more health and vibrancy to the plant with the fungi being present. Absolutely, we used to irradiate all of the plants to remove them. Now you can purchase what they call root rocket and grow it with your plants. It increases growth and survival of like plants that you're planting in your yard. And I love this figure here. So this is a figure from a study done in the 1950s on pine trees that were either treated with mycorrhiza or not treated with mycorrhiza. And what they found was that over the course of 5 years, the pine trees with mycorrhiza grew to about 6 feet in height, whereas the ones that were not treated with the mycorrhiza grew to about 2 feet in height. That's a very considerable difference, especially because pine trees don't grow that fast. And we can definitely argue then that the mycorrhiza have a huge impact on plant growth, not just visually, but we have long-term studies that support that, okay? It's super ancient relationship that actually potentially led to plants being able to live on land at all. All right. Last but not least, on the economic benefits of fungi. Fungi produce medicines and many types of foods. I'm not a huge mushroom eater, but I do like some of the oyster mushrooms and like shiitake mushrooms. Penicillium was the original source of penicillin, the first antibiotic that absolutely changed the course of human history. Penicillin is produced by or penicillium is produced by that fungus as a result of bacteria. It's actually producing it as an enzyme to break down and eat the bacteria. But we found it and used it as a food source, not a food source, as a medicine source. Yeast obviously plays a huge role in fermentation, as we've talked about in bacteria and in our cellular respiration. Fermentation is so important for bread, beer, wine. There are some places in the world where fresh water is not available, and having fermented foods like beer and wine are actually really beneficial to increasing survivorship, because dirty water is not good. Mushroom consumption has steadily increased in the United States, especially as more and more is understood about the benefits of fungi in things like lion's mane has been said to improve cognitive function. It's hit and miss. I don't know the long-term studies, but there's definitely going to be some health benefits connected to fungi that we're just now getting into researching a lot more. Super useful, actually a good part of your diet. Do not go eat wild mushrooms though, please. I have to throw this out there. There are some fungi that you can go and forage, absolutely. However, be very careful if you are going to do that. Do not eat wild mushrooms. I'm not a fan. Granted, you can eat everything once, but there are a lot of fungi that do produce allergic reactions and toxins in humans that do kill them every year, even in very experienced foragers. So if you are going to eat some of these weird different mushrooms, try to buy the ones that are grown and grown safely and sustainably, rather than maybe going out and finding the ones in the wild, unless you are like 1,020% sure. Okay. This is just a quick comparison of fungi, plants, and animals. I do suggest looking at that because that would help you fill in some of those tables. And that is it for chapter 18. I think that's it. If you have any questions, let me know. Thank you all for joining along.